Hello, friends. If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The coffee in my thermos had gone cold 2 hours ago, but I kept drinking it out of habit rather than necessity. It was approaching 11 p.m. on a February night, and I was sitting in my truck by the shore of Lake Kusawa longer than I should have been. The temperature gauge on my dashboard read minus 42 degrees. Outside, there was that special silence you only feel in extreme cold, as if the air had frozen and sound could no longer pass through it. I'm a wildlife officer for the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, and I've been working this territory for going on 9 years now. Kusawa Lake sits about 40 miles northwest of the Canadian border, and during winter it becomes one of those places where people come to ice fish, snowmobile, and generally test how much cold a human body can withstand before things start going wrong. My job is to patrol these areas, check fishing licenses, make sure nobody's gotten themselves into trouble. It's usually pretty straightforward work. Usually. That night, I was doing a late sweep of the lake's camping areas. We'd gotten a call around 7 p.m. from a guy who said he'd heard something strange out on the ice, but when dispatch tried to get more details, his phone cut out. Signal up here is like that. You might get 2 bars 1 minute and nothing the next. Still, we have to check these things out. People die in the wilderness every year from the simplest mistakes, and sometimes the difference between life and death is whether someone bothered to drive out and take a look. The lake stretched out in front of me like a vast white plain, the ice covered in about 8 inches of snow. My headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the nearest camping area, a small cluster of 4 RVs and a couple of heavy-duty tents. I could see lights on in 2 of the RVs, which was normal enough. What wasn't normal was that there were no snowmobiles parked outside, no signs of recent activity around the tents, and no smoke coming from any of the camps. In cold like this, you keep a fire or heater going constantly. You don't have a choice. I grabbed my flashlight and radio, pulled my parka hood up tight, and stepped out into the cold. The shock of it hit me like a physical thing. That first breath seared my lungs and made my eyes water instantly. I'd dressed properly. Thermal layers, insulated overalls, face mask, the works. But minus 40 doesn't care what you're wearing. It finds ways to get through. The snow crunched under my boots with that distinctive squeak that only happens at extreme temperatures. I made my way toward the first RV, playing my flashlight beam across the ground as I walked. There were footprints, but they were old, partially filled in with snow, which meant they'd been there at least a day or 2. No fresh tracks. That was starting to feel wrong. I knocked on the RV door, calling out my identification. No answer. I tried the handle and found it unlocked, which sent up another red flag. Nobody leaves their shelter unlocked when it's this cold. If something happened and you needed to get back inside quickly, you'd want easy access, sure. But you'd also know that an unlocked door in the wilderness is an invitation for animals. Or worse, the inside of the RV was dim, lit only by my flashlight beam. It was cold. Not as cold as outside, but cold enough that I could see my breath. The heater was off. I swept the light around and saw signs of recent occupation. An open bag of chips on the counter, a jacket hung on a hook, a magazine laid open on the small dinette table. The beds were made but rumpled, like someone had been sitting on them. Everything looked normal except for the fact that nobody was there. "Hello?" I called out, knowing it was pointless. "Alaska Wildlife Officer, anyone here?" Nothing. Just the sound of my own breathing. I backed out and moved to the next RV. Same story, lights on, heater off, signs of recent life, but no actual people. The third RV was completely dark, and when I looked in the windows I could see frost forming on the inside of the glass. That one had been empty for a while. The tents were worse. One of them had partially collapsed under the weight of snow, and when I unzipped the flap and looked inside, I found sleeping bags and camping gear all neatly arranged, but again, no people. The second tent was still standing, and inside I found something that made me pause. A camp stove that had melted through the tent floor. It was stone cold now, but at some point it had been running hot enough and long enough to burn a hole right through the synthetic material and scorch the ice beneath. That's the kind of mistake that kills people, but there was no body, no signs of struggle or panic, just a burned hole and an empty tent. I radioed back to dispatch, reported what I was finding. The woman on the other end, Sharon, I'd known her for years, sounded concerned but not alarmed. People leave campsites, she reasoned. Maybe they all went to town together, carpooled in one vehicle. Maybe they'd been planning to come back but got delayed. It happened, but it didn't feel right. I told her I was going to do a wider sweep of the area, check the lake itself. She said to be careful and keep my radio on. I got back in my truck and started driving slowly along the shoreline, playing my spotlight across the ice. The lake was maybe 2 miles across at its widest point, and the ice was solid. I'd checked the thickness reports before coming out, and it was running at 28 inches minimum. Safe enough to drive a truck on, which people did all the time during fishing season. About halfway around the lake's perimeter, I stopped. Something had caught my eye. A dark shape out on the ice, maybe 300 yards from shore. I focused the spotlight on it and felt my stomach drop a little. It was a snowmobile, sitting motionless, and even from this distance I could tell the engine wasn't running because I couldn't see any exhaust steam. I grabbed my gear and headed out onto the ice on foot. Walking on a frozen lake at night is an eerie experience under the best circumstances. The ice makes sounds, creaks and groans and occasional sharp cracks that sound like gunshots. It's natural, just the ice expanding and contracting with temperature changes, but it never stops being unsettling. Every step feels like it might be the one that breaks through, even though logically you know the ice is 2 feet thick. The snowmobile was a newer model, red and black, dusted with snow. The key was still in the ignition. I tried to start it, but the engine was completely dead, frozen solid probably. There was a small cargo box on the back, and when I opened it I found a tackle box, some fishing line, and a handheld GPS unit. The GPS was off, and when I tried to turn it on, nothing happened. Dead battery or frozen electronics. What I didn't find was any sign of the rider. No tracks leading away from the machine, no blood, nothing. Just a snowmobile sitting in the middle of a frozen lake with its operator vanished. I was starting to feel genuinely uneasy now. This wasn't normal. This wasn't a case of people carpooling to town. This was something else. I radioed Sharon again, gave her the update. She said she'd try to get a trooper to head my way, but the nearest one was in Whitehorse, at least 3 hours out in good weather. I told her I'd keep looking. That's when I heard it for the first time. It came from beneath the ice, a low, resonant boom that I felt as much as heard. It made my chest cavity vibrate like standing next to a massive speaker. I froze, listening. 5 seconds passed. Then another boom, deeper this time, and with it came a sound like something dragging across the underside of the ice. Not scratching, dragging, like something heavy being pulled along. The ice beneath my feet was 2 feet thick and solid as concrete. Nothing could be under there. Nothing living anyway. The lake was too cold, too deep. Even if something had somehow gotten trapped under the ice, it would have died within minutes. Boom. Drag, boom, drag. The sounds were moving, tracking from my right to my left, passing directly underneath where I stood. I could follow their progress by the vibration in my boots. Whatever was making that sound was big enough that each impact sent waves through the ice that I could physically feel. I started backing toward the shore, keeping my flashlight pointed down at the ice. I don't know what I expected to see. The ice was covered in snow, opaque and impenetrable, but some instinct made me keep watching it anyway. The booming stopped. The dragging stopped. Everything went completely silent. I made it back to my truck, got inside and locked the doors, which was stupid because what was a lock going to do against whatever that was? But it made me feel better anyway. I sat there with the engine running and the heater blasting, trying to think rationally about what I'd just experienced. Ice makes noise, I knew that. Thermal expansion, pressure changes, stress fractures, all of that creates sounds. Sometimes it can sound almost like voices, like music, like things that aren't really there. It's a known phenomenon. I'd heard it before, just never quite like this. I called Sharon back, told her what I'd heard. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "Tom, I think you should come back in. We can send a team out in the morning with better equipment." I agreed. I was about to put the truck in gear when I saw movement near the abandoned snowmobile. I hit it with the spotlight. There was someone standing next to the machine, just standing there, perfectly still, facing toward my truck. I couldn't make out any details. They were too far away, and the snow had started falling harder, creating a haze in the spotlight beam. But it was definitely a person, or at least the shape of one. I grabbed my radio mic. "Sharon, I've got someone out here, by the abandoned snowmobile. Can you make contact?" "Working on it." I hit the truck's PA system, my voice booming out across the ice. "This is Alaska Wildlife Officer Tom Hadley. I need you to walk toward my vehicle with your hands visible." The figure didn't move, didn't even seem to react, just stood there. I tried again. "I need you to identify yourself and approach my vehicle." Nothing. The snow was getting heavier, and I was starting to lose visibility. I made a decision I probably shouldn't have. I grabbed my flashlight and got out of the truck again. The cold hit me even harder this time, or maybe it just felt that way because I was scared. I started walking toward the figure, my flashlight beam cutting through the falling snow. As I got closer, I could see more details. They were wearing dark clothes, no reflective gear, no obvious winter equipment. Just standing there in -40 weather like it was nothing. 50 yards away. 40. 30. "Sir or ma'am, I need you to respond to me," I called out. 20 yards. And then I could see clearly, and my blood went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. It wasn't a person. It was a shape, a silhouette, but there was nothing solid to it. I could see through it, to the ice and snow beyond. Like looking at someone through frosted glass, except there was no glass, just this translucent form standing motionless on the frozen lake. I stopped walking. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, to get back to the truck, to get off this lake and never come back. But I couldn't move. I just stood there, flashlight shaking in my hand, staring at this thing that shouldn't exist. The boom came again, right beneath my feet, so loud and so strong that I actually stumbled. And then another, and I realized the sounds were coming from directly under where the figure stood. The dragging sound came back too, and now I could hear something else underneath it. A sound that might have been wind, or might have been a voice, or might have been something else entirely. The figure turned and started walking away from me, moving out toward the center of the lake. Its movements were wrong, too smooth, too gliding, not walking, floating. I ran back to my truck, got inside, and locked the doors again. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely work the radio. "Sharon, I'm coming in, right now." "Tom, what's wrong?" I'll tell you when I get there. I'm leaving the lake. I put the truck in gear and drove away from that cursed place as fast as the snow-covered road would let me. I didn't look in my mirrors. I didn't want to see if that thing was following me. Back at the station, I filed my report. I left out the part about the translucent figure. I'm not an idiot, I know how that sounds. But I included everything else. The abandoned camps, the snowmobile, the sounds from under the ice. A team went out the next morning. They found all the same things I'd found: empty camps, abandoned snowmobile, no signs of the occupants. They also found 3 more snowmobiles scattered across the lake, all abandoned, all with their keys still in them. They searched for 2 days and never found a single person. The official report listed it as multiple missing persons, likely due to environmental exposure and confusion caused by extreme cold. People wander off, get disoriented, succumb to hypothermia. It happens. The families were notified. The case eventually went cold, filed away with all the other wilderness disappearances that happen in Alaska every year. But I know what I saw, and I know what I heard. I avoided Lake Kusawa for 2 years after that. Couldn't bring myself to go near it. Always found reasons to assign those patrols to other officers. But eventually, I ran out of excuses, and I had to go back. It was a summer run, broad daylight, checking on some hikers who'd reported seeing a bear near the trailhead. Routine stuff. But I had to cross the southern edge of the lake to get to the trail, and as I drove past, I found myself looking out across the water. It was beautiful in summer, crystal clear, reflecting the sky. Nothing like the frozen wasteland it had been that February night. I stopped my truck and got out, standing at the edge of the shore. The water was calm, barely a ripple. I don't know what made me do it. Curiosity, maybe, or some need to prove to myself that it had all been in my head. But I cupped my hands around my mouth and called out across the lake. "Hello?" My voice echoed off the water and faded. Silence. Just the quiet lap of waves against the shore. The whisper of wind through the trees. I was about to turn away when I heard it. Boom. Deep, resonant, impossible. Coming from beneath the water, just like before. Boom. I got in my truck and drove away. I haven't been back to Lake Kusawa since then, and I never will. They can fire me if they want, I don't care. Because the last thing I heard, as I was driving away, was my own voice calling back to me from across that lake. The same word I'd called out, in the same tone, with the same inflection. "Hello?" And it was coming from underwater. They briefed me on the basics back in Anchorage before I took this position, but there's a lot they don't tell you about being a wildlife officer in the Alaskan interior. They tell you about hypothermia protocols, and bear safety, and how to handle aggressive moose. They tell you about the paperwork and the radio procedures and the importance of checking in regularly with dispatch. What they don't tell you is how the isolation gets inside your head, how the silence becomes a presence all its own, and how sometimes you'll see things in the wilderness that don't have explanations in any manual they ever gave you. My name is Sarah Chen, and I've been working the Brooks Range territory for 6 years. It's some of the most remote country in Alaska. We're talking hundreds of square miles of tundra, mountains, and taiga forest where you might not see another human being for weeks at a time. Most of my work involves monitoring wildlife populations, tracking migration patterns, and occasionally dealing with hunters or hikers who've bitten off more than they can chew. The territory is so vast that I spend about 3 weeks out of every month in the field, living out of a small cabin near the Itkilik River, accessible only by bush plane or, in winter, snowmobile. March is a strange time up here. We're coming out of the deep winter darkness, getting more daylight every week, but the cold is still brutal, often dipping to -30 or worse, and the snow is deep, sometimes 10 or 12 feet in the valleys. The animals are starting to move, preparing for spring, and that's when my job gets busiest. I was doing a routine survey of the winter range, documenting caribou numbers and checking for wolf activity, when I found the first track. It was on a ridge about 8 miles north of my cabin, a windswept area where the snow was packed hard and relatively shallow. I'd been following a caribou trail, noting the herd's direction and the condition of the animals based on their tracks, when I came across something that made me stop dead. The track was huge, easily 3 times the size of a wolf print, bigger than any bear print I'd ever seen. It was roughly circular, maybe 14 inches across, with what looked like 4 distinct toe impressions at the front. But the weird thing was the depth. This track was pressed deep into the snow, much deeper than the caribou tracks around it, suggesting something incredibly heavy. Yet there was only one track. Not a trail, not a series of prints, just one single massive depression in the snow, and then nothing. I crouched down next to it, pulling off my glove to feel inside the track. The edges were crisp and well-defined, not melted or distorted, which meant it was relatively fresh, probably within the last day or so. I looked around for more tracks, any sign of where this thing had come from or gone to, but there was nothing. Just that one impossible print sitting by itself in the middle of an otherwise undisturbed snowfield. I took photos, made notes, and marked the GPS coordinates. Probably some kind of unusual weather phenomenon, I told myself. Maybe a chunk of ice had fallen from somewhere and left an odd impression. But even as I thought it, I knew that didn't make sense. The track had too much definition, too much structure. It looked biological. I continued my survey, trying to put the strange track out of my mind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The normal sounds of the wilderness, the occasional bird call, the rustle of small animals in the brush, seemed muted, distant. The sky had that peculiar flat quality that comes before a storm, and the air felt heavy despite the cold. About 2 miles further along the ridge, I found another track. This one was identical to the first. Same size, same depth, same strange solitary appearance. But what made my skin crawl was its location. It was positioned in a spot that would have required whatever made the first track to cross a steep ravine and climb a nearly vertical rock face to reach. No animal could have done that. Nothing could have. I stood there staring at the track, my radio in my hand, wondering if I should call it in. But what would I say? I found 2 weird footprints? They'd think I was losing it out here, and maybe I was. 6 years of isolation does things to your perception. You start seeing patterns that aren't there, assigning meaning to random events. That's what I was telling myself when I heard the sound. It came from somewhere behind me, down in the ravine I'd just been thinking about. A low, resonant call, not quite a howl, not quite a roar, but something in between. It lasted about 5 seconds and then cut off abruptly. In all my years up here, I'd never heard anything like it. Wolves don't sound like that. Bears don't sound like that. Even the bull moose with their strange grunting calls don't make that kind of noise. I stayed very still, listening. The wind had picked up, creating a constant background whisper through the sparse trees. But underneath it, I thought I could hear something else, a rhythmic crunching sound, like footsteps in snow. My hand went to the .45 on my hip. I carry it for bears, though I've never had to use it. Bear spray is usually enough, and making noise is better than both. But right then, I wanted the weight of that gun in my hand. The crunching sounds were getting closer. I turned slowly, scanning the ravine below, but I couldn't see anything through the scattered spruce and the blowing snow. The sounds seemed to be coming from multiple directions at once, echoing off the rocks in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint a source. I made a decision. I started walking back toward my snowmobile, which I'd left about a mile back at the base of the ridge. I didn't run. Running triggers a prey response in predators, and besides, you can't run in deep snow anyway. But I walked fast, keeping my hand on my gun, stopping every 100 yards or so to listen. The crunching sounds followed me. They stayed at the same distance, never getting closer but never falling behind either. Whatever was making them was matching my pace exactly. I reached my snowmobile just as the first flakes of snow started falling. A storm was rolling in fast. I could see the wall of white advancing across the valley, and I knew I had maybe 30 minutes to get back to the cabin before visibility went to zero. I started the engine, grateful for the familiar roar of the machine, and headed down the valley at a speed that was probably unsafe given the terrain. I made it back to the cabin with about 10 minutes to spare before the storm hit in earnest. Once inside, I secured all the shutters, started a fire in the wood stove, and tried to settle my nerves. The cabin is small but solid. One main room with a sleeping area, a kitchen corner, and a small attached shed for storage. It's not much, but it's survived decades of brutal weather, and the thick log walls make me feel safe. That night, I couldn't sleep. The storm was howling outside, rattling the shutters and piling snow against the walls. But underneath the wind, I kept thinking I heard that crunching sound again, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. At around 2 a.m., my radio crackled to life. Unit 7, Unit 7. It was dispatch, but the signal was weak and filled with static. I grabbed the handset. This is Unit 7, go ahead. Unit 7, check. Position. Say again, dispatch, you're breaking up. Nothing but static. Then, just before the signal cut out completely, not alone. My blood went cold. I tried to raise them again, but the radio was dead. The storm was too strong, creating too much interference. I was cut off, probably for the next day or two until the weather cleared. I sat there in the dark cabin, the only light coming from the dying fire in the stove, and listened. The storm sounds were constant. Wind shrieking around the corners of the cabin, snow hissing against the walls. But there was something else. Something underneath. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Footsteps. Heavy ones. Circling the cabin just like I'd heard in my head. Except this wasn't in my head. This was real. I moved to the window, cracked the shutter slightly, and looked out into the storm. The snow was coming down so hard I could barely see 10 feet. But in the brief moments when the wind would shift and clear the air, I could see them. Tracks. All around the cabin. Huge, deep impressions in the fresh snow, forming a perfect circle. And as I watched, another one appeared, just materialized in the snow about 20 feet from the cabin, as if something invisible had just taken a step. I slammed the shutter closed and backed away from the window, my heart hammering. This wasn't possible. Things don't make tracks without being there to make them. But I'd seen it happen, watched the snow compress under weight that wasn't there. The crunching continued all night. Sometimes it would stop for long stretches, and I'd start to think it was over, that I'd imagined it all. Then it would start again, always that same deliberate pace, always that same circular pattern around the cabin. I must have dozed off around dawn, because I woke with a start to find the cabin freezing. The fire had gone out hours ago. The storm had passed, and weak sunlight was filtering through cracks in the shutters. The radio was still dead. I bundled up and opened the door carefully, my gun drawn. The world outside was transformed, buried under at least 3 feet of new snow. Everything was white and pristine and silent, except for the tracks. They were everywhere, covering every square inch of the area around my cabin. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all that same huge circular shape, pressed deep into the new snow. They didn't form any kind of logical pattern. Some overlapped, some were clustered together, others spread out at random. It looked like a whole herd of something had been out here during the night, trampling the snow in some kind of frenzied dance. But in the absolute center of all of them, right in front of my door, was a single caribou carcass. It was fresh. Steam was still rising from it in the cold air. Something had killed it recently, within the last hour or so, and left it here. The caribou's neck was broken, but there were no other visible injuries, no signs of feeding. Just a clean kill, and then what, an offering? I didn't touch it. I went back inside, got my satellite phone working, and called for an emergency pickup. The bush pilot who came to get me later that day asked why I was cutting my rotation short, and I told him equipment problems. He didn't argue. Pilots up here know better than to ask too many questions. I took a week off, stayed in Anchorage, tried to convince myself that there was some rational explanation for what I'd experienced. Weather phenomena, I told myself. Unusual ice formations creating strange impressions. Audio hallucinations caused by isolation and stress. These are all documented things that happen to people in remote environments. But I couldn't explain the caribou, and I couldn't explain what happened when I went back. The cabin looked fine from the outside. The storm damage was minimal, and someone from the service had been by to check on it and clear the snow. I went inside, unpacked my gear, and tried to settle back into the routine. On my second night back, around midnight, my radio crackled to life again. Unit 7, Unit 7. I grabbed it immediately. This is Unit 7, go ahead. Nothing but static. Then, just barely audible, not alone. Dispatch, you're breaking up, say again. The static cleared for just a moment, and I heard it clearly. Unit 7, this is dispatch. We're showing your position as Sarah. Are you at the cabin? Yes, I'm at the cabin. What's wrong? We're showing 2 signals at your location. 2 Unit 7 transponders. Are you alone? My mouth went dry. Yes, I'm alone. It must be a glitch in your system. Stand by, we're sending someone to check it out. But I didn't stand by. Because right then I heard it again. That crunching sound outside, slow and deliberate, and with it, something new. The sound of my own voice, very faint, coming from somewhere in the darkness outside. Yes, I'm alone. My words, in my voice, repeated back to me from the night. I grabbed everything I could carry and ran for my snowmobile. I didn't wait for help. I drove through the darkness with my headlight cutting a weak beam through the endless black, and I didn't look back. I requested a transfer the next week. They approved it without question. Turnover is high in the remote postings, and they're always short-staffed. I moved to a territory near Juneau, much more populated, much less isolated. I told myself I was done with the deep wilderness. But last month, I got a package at my new station. No return address, just my name and unit number. Inside was a photo, a trail camera image from somewhere in the Brooks Range, time-stamped from 3 weeks ago. The image showed my old cabin at night, and standing in front of it, clearly visible in the camera's flash, was a figure. It was shaped like a person, my height, my build, but it was wrong, blurred at the edges, somehow both there and not there at the same time. It was wearing my uniform, my exact uniform, down to the patch on the shoulder. And in the snow, all around it, circling the cabin in an endless spiral, were tracks. I still check my windows every night before I sleep. The map was wrong. That's the first thing I should have noticed. But when you're 3 days into a solo patrol in the Wrangell Mountains and the temperature is sitting at -35, you don't always catch the small details. You're too focused on staying warm, keeping your bearings, and making sure you don't do something stupid that gets you killed. Alaska doesn't forgive mistakes, and the wilderness up here has claimed plenty of people who thought they knew better. I'm Marcus Webb, been a wildlife officer for 14 years now, the last 7 working this section of the Wrangell-St. Elias backcountry. It's massive territory, over 13 million acres, most of it completely wild, with maybe a handful of ranger stations scattered throughout for emergency shelter. We patrol on snowmobile in winter, checking on trappers, monitoring wildlife, and occasionally pulling some lost hiker's ass out of trouble. It's hard work, lonely work, but I prefer it to the politics and crowding down in the populated areas. I was on a routine run between 2 stations, a trip that normally takes about 5 hours if the weather holds. But a freak snowstorm had rolled in overnight, dumping nearly 2 feet of new powder and cutting visibility to almost nothing. I decided to push through anyway. I'd made this run dozens of times and knew the route by muscle memory. But 3 hours in, my snowmobile hit something under the snow, some buried rock or log, and the track broke. Not catastrophically, but enough that continuing on was risky. I could probably limp another mile or 2 before the whole thing gave out. I pulled out my map and GPS to figure out my options. According to both, I was about 8 miles from the next official station, too far to risk on a damaged machine. But as I was studying the map, I noticed something odd, a small mark on the paper that I'd never seen before, indicating a structure about a half-mile to the west of my current position. It was labeled in faded pencil, Ranger Cabin, Emergency Use. I'd worked this territory for 7 years and had never known about any cabin in this area. The official stations were all marked clearly on my maps, and this one wasn't on any of them. But old ranger cabins do exist throughout Alaska, built decades ago and sometimes forgotten, left off modern maps. They're usually in rough shape, but still weatherproof enough to provide shelter in an emergency. Given my situation, a half-mile was doable on foot, and if the cabin was even marginally intact, I could hole up there while I radioed for assistance. I grabbed my emergency pack, my rifle, and my radio, and set off on snowshoes into the white. The storm was getting worse, the wind driving the snow almost horizontally, and within minutes I'd lost sight of my snowmobile despite it being only 50 yards behind me. I followed my compass heading west, counting steps to track distance. The terrain was fairly level, mostly open tundra with scattered clusters of black spruce, their dark forms looming out of the white-like sentinels. I almost walked right past the cabin. It appeared suddenly through the storm, a small structure maybe 20 feet by 15, built from dark logs that were nearly invisible against the snow. It had a peaked roof with a metal chimney, a single door on the front, and one window beside it. The door was closed, and there were no tracks in the fresh snow around it, which made sense. This place was clearly abandoned. I approached cautiously, calling out anyway. "Hello, anyone home? Alaska Fish and Game?" No response. Just the howl of wind and the hiss of snow. The door wasn't locked, which was standard for emergency shelters in Alaska. You never lock a cabin in the wilderness because you never know when someone might need it to survive. I pushed it open and stepped inside, pulling the door closed behind me against the wind. The sudden silence was startling. The wind noise dropped to a muffled whisper, and I could hear my own breathing echoing in the small space. I pulled out my flashlight and swept the beam around. The cabin was wrong. Not dangerous wrong, not horror movie wrong, but wrong in a way I couldn't immediately put my finger on. It was clean. Too clean. The floor had been swept recently, no dust or debris. There was a wood stove in the corner with a neat stack of split wood beside it. A small table with 2 chairs sat under the window. A shelf held canned goods, their labels bright and unfaded. A sleeping bag was rolled up on a cot in the corner, and hanging from a peg on the wall was a ranger's jacket. Alaska Fish and Game, just like mine. The weird thing was that it all looked new. Not old emergency supplies that had been here for years, but fresh provisions, like someone had just stocked the place. The wood was recently split, still showing light-colored inner grain. The canned goods had dates from this year. Even the jacket looked barely worn. I set down my pack and moved to the stove. The metal was still warm, not hot, but warm enough that I could feel it through my glove when I touched it. Someone had been here recently, within the last few hours at most. "Hello?" I called out again, louder this time. "Is anyone here?" Nothing. The cabin was small enough that I could see the whole interior at a glance. One room, no closets, no hidden spaces. I was alone. I radioed back to dispatch. "Unit 12 to base, come in." Static. I adjusted the frequency and tried again. Nothing. The storm was interfering with the signal, which wasn't unusual out here. I'd try again in a few hours when the weather cleared. With nothing else to do, I decided to make myself comfortable. I started a fire in the stove. The wood caught easily, which told me it had been burning recently, and took stock of my situation. My snowmobile was damaged but not destroyed, and once the storm passed, I could radio for assistance or make repairs. In the meantime, I had shelter, heat, and supplies. Things could be worse. I found a pot on the shelf and melted some snow for water, then made myself coffee using the instant packets from my pack. As I sat at the small table drinking it, I noticed something on the surface. A ring of condensation, circular and recent, like someone had just been sitting here with a hot mug. I put my hand near it and could still feel the faint moisture. The rational part of my brain said it was probably from me, that I'd put something down without noticing, but I hadn't put anything on the table. I'd been standing by the stove the whole time. I stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the storm. Visibility was maybe 10 feet, just a wall of white. But as I watched, I thought I saw movement. A dark shape passing by the window, human-sized, moving from left to right. I turned and looked at the door, half expecting it to open, but it remained closed. I waited, counting seconds. At 30, I moved to the door and opened it, looking out. Nothing. No tracks in the snow, no signs of movement, just the storm. I closed the door and slid the simple bolt lock into place. It was flimsy. Wouldn't stop a determined person or animal, but it made me feel better. I went back to the table and tried the radio again. Still nothing but static. As I sat there, I started noticing other small things. The sleeping bag on the cot was arranged too perfectly, the corners tucked with military precision. The canned goods on the shelf were organized by type and size, labels all facing forward. Even the wood beside the stove was stacked with geometric precision, each piece exactly parallel to the others. It was the kind of organization you'd expect from someone with OCD, except it felt wrong. Too perfect, too deliberate, like a stage set rather than a living space. On the shelf above the canned goods, I found a logbook. Every ranger cabin has one, a place for visitors to record their stays, note weather conditions, report any issues with the structure. I flipped it open, expecting to see entries from over the years. The book was empty, completely blank, not a single entry. That's when I started to get seriously uneasy. A cabin this well-maintained, this well-stocked, would have a logbook full of entries. Even if it was an old, forgotten shelter, there would be something. Notes from trappers, hunters, hikers, previous rangers. But there was nothing, just blank pages, fresh and clean. I pulled out my own notebook and wrote down what I could remember of the cabin's location, sketching a rough map. If this place wasn't on the official records, it should be. Someone was clearly maintaining it, keeping it stocked and ready for emergencies. That person deserved recognition. The storm continued through the afternoon and into evening. I made myself a meal from my own supplies. I didn't want to touch the canned goods without knowing who they belonged to, and settled into the cot. The sleeping bag was actually very comfortable, clean, and warm. As I lay there, I found myself staring at the ceiling, studying the log beams and the flickering light from the stove. There was writing up there, carved into the wood. I sat up and angled my flashlight to read it. "Stay inside after dark." That was all, just those 4 words, carved deep into the beam. The letters were weathered, not fresh, which meant they'd been there for years. Below them, in fresher carving, someone had added, "He doesn't like visitors." A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the temperature. I looked around the cabin again, seeing it in a new light. The perfect organization, the fresh supplies, the absence of dust or dirt. It wasn't just well maintained. It was actively inhabited. Someone lived here, or at least spent enough time here to keep everything pristine. But who? And why wasn't it on any maps? I got up and checked the door bolt, making sure it was secure. Then I checked the window, which had no lock but was too small for an adult to climb through anyway. I pulled my rifle closer to the cot, keeping it within arm's reach. The wind had died down as darkness fell, and in the new silence I could hear other sounds. The settling of the cabin's logs, the occasional pop from the stove, and something else, a sound I couldn't quite place, like fabric rustling or footsteps on snow coming from outside. I moved to the window and looked out. Night had fallen completely, and without any light pollution, it was absolutely black. I couldn't see anything, but something was out there. I could feel it, that same instinct that tells you when you're being watched. I've hunted enough, spent enough time in the wilderness to trust that feeling. I turned off my flashlight and let my eyes adjust to the darkness. The only light came from the small window in the stove door, a faint orange glow that barely illuminated the cabin interior. I sat on the cot, rifle across my lap, and waited. Hours passed. I might have dozed off, I'm not sure. But I woke with a start to the sound of footsteps outside, crunching in the snow. Slow, deliberate footsteps, walking around the cabin in a circle. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped at the door. I could see the door itself in the dim glow from the stove, could see the bolt still in place. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the handle turned, very slowly, testing. The bolt held. The handle released and the footsteps continued around the cabin, passing by the window. I couldn't see anything through the glass. It was too dark, but I could hear them clearly. They completed the circuit and stopped again at the door. This time, there was a knock. 3 measured taps. Every instinct I had told me not to respond, to stay silent, to wait it out. But I'm a ranger, and part of my job is helping people. What if someone was actually in trouble out there, lost in the storm, needing help? I moved to the door, keeping my rifle in one hand. "Who's there?" No response, just silence. "I'm with Alaska Fish and Game. If you need assistance, identify yourself." Still nothing. I waited, counting to 30 in my head. The silence stretched on. I made a decision. I kept the bolt in place and cracked the door open just enough to look out through the gap. The night air rushed in, brutally cold. I angled my flashlight through the opening and swept the area in front of the cabin. Nothing, no one. Fresh snow had fallen, and there were no footprints anywhere. None. I closed the door quickly, heart pounding. I'd heard those footsteps. I hadn't imagined them. They'd been real, solid, close enough to shake the cabin door. But there was no one there, no tracks to show anyone had been there. I slid the bolt back in place and backed away from the door. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I sat on the cot with my rifle and watched the door, listening to the silence. Dawn came slowly. the dim light gradually filling the cabin. The storm had passed, and when I looked out the window, I could see clear sky. I tried the radio and got through to dispatch immediately. I reported my situation, damaged snowmobile, emergency shelter, and they said they'd have someone out to me within a few hours. I spent the time waiting by packing up my gear and examining the cabin more closely in daylight. I found more carved messages on various beams. Don't look outside after midnight. He's always watching. The cabin protects. They were all in different handwriting, carved at different times. Some weathered with age, others more recent. Someone had been maintaining this place for years, decades maybe. Someone who knew something about this area that wasn't in any official records. I also found the coffee cup. It was sitting on the counter beside the stove, and I'm absolutely certain it hadn't been there the night before. It was still warm. Fresh coffee, recently poured, steam still rising from the surface. I grabbed my things and went outside to wait, standing in the snow 20 yards from the cabin, rifle in hand. I didn't go back inside, even though it was cold. I just waited, watching that door, until I heard the snowmobiles coming. The rescue team arrived around noon. 2 rangers I knew, Ben and Sarah. They'd brought a spare track for my snowmobile and tools to make the repair. As we worked on the machine, I asked them about the cabin. "What cabin?" Ben said. I pointed back the way I'd come. "Emergency shelter, about a half-mile west of here. Small log structure, 1 room, well stocked." Ben and Sarah looked at each other, then back at me. "Marcus, there's no cabin out here. The nearest shelter is the station you were headed for, 8 miles northeast. No, I stayed there last night. It's right, but when I turned to point, I couldn't see it. The cabin should have been visible from where we stood, even through the trees. I'd walked in a straight line from it to my snowmobile, but there was nothing there, just undisturbed snow and scattered spruce. We hiked over to where I thought it had been. No cabin, no clearing, no signs that anything had ever been built there. Just wilderness, untouched, the snow smooth and unbroken." Ben put a hand on my shoulder. "Hypothermia can cause hallucinations, Marcus. You probably found shelter under some trees and your brain filled in the rest. It happens." I wanted to argue, but what could I say? The cabin was gone. Maybe it had never been there at all. We finished repairing my snowmobile, and I rode back to the station with them. I filed my report, leaving out the parts about the cabin that I couldn't prove existed. I took a week off, told everyone I was just tired, needed a break, but I know what I saw, I know what I heard. And 3 weeks ago, I was looking through some archived files at the main office, old reports from the 1970s, and I found a photograph. It showed a ranger standing in front of a small log cabin, smiling at the camera. The photo was labeled Emergency Shelter Number 7, Wrangell Mountains, 1974. The ranger in the photo was wearing the same uniform I'd seen hanging in the cabin. Same patch, same style, same everything. The ranger in the photo was me. Same face, same build, same everything. The photo was taken 20 years before I was born. The sun doesn't really set in Alaska during summer, and it doesn't really rise during winter. We get the in-between seasons, sure, but they're brief. A few weeks in spring, when everything melts and turns to mud. A few weeks in fall, when the colors explode before the first snow. Most of the year, you're either living in perpetual daylight or perpetual darkness, and both mess with your head in different ways. I've been doing this job long enough to know that the darkness is worse, much worse. December in the Yukon-Charlie Rivers territory is 21 hours of night and 3 hours of weak twilight that barely qualifies as day. The temperature hovers around -40, sometimes colder, and the landscape becomes this alien world of black and white. White snow, black trees, and a sky that's just barely lighter than the ground. It's beautiful in a stark, terrifying way, but it's also the kind of place that reminds you just how small you are, how quickly the wilderness can kill you if you make a mistake. I've been stationed here for 6 years now, and I've learned to read the darkness the way some people read books. Every sound has meaning. Every shift in the wind carries information. The quality of silence can tell you if there's a storm coming, if there's a predator nearby, if something is wrong. You develop instincts out here that you don't have in the city, primitive awareness that humans used to have before we built walls and turned on lights and forgot what it means to be prey. My wife Rebecca used to ask me why I kept taking these remote postings, why I didn't request a transfer somewhere closer to civilization, somewhere she could visit more than once every few months. I never had a good answer for her. How do you explain that the darkness feels like home? That the silence is comfortable? That being alone in 600 square miles of wilderness feels more natural than being in a room full of people? She stopped asking eventually, and then she stopped calling, and then she stopped being my wife. The divorce papers came through last February, and I signed them in this same cabin where I'm sitting now, with the temperature at -50 outside, and the aurora dancing green and purple across the sky. Maybe that's why what happened affected me the way it did. Because I thought I understood the darkness. I thought I knew what lived in it, what rules it followed. I was wrong. My name is David Ortiz, and I work a patrol route that covers about 600 square miles of river valleys and taiga forest along the Canadian border. Most of my winter work involves checking on trappers, making sure they're following regulations, monitoring wolf populations, and occasionally responding to the rare tourist who thought December in the Arctic Circle would be a good time for an adventure. It's lonely work, but I've always preferred solitude to crowds, and there's something about the absolute silence of the winter wilderness that I find centering. I grew up in New Mexico, in the heat and the desert sun, which makes my choice of career seem strange to most people. My father was a ranger in Carlsbad Caverns, and he used to take me down into those caves when I was a kid, deep underground where the darkness was absolute and the silence was profound. He taught me that darkness isn't something to fear. It's just the absence of light, neutral and natural. He taught me to be comfortable in it, to trust my other senses, to understand that humans are just visitors in spaces that belong to something older. He died when I was 19, heart attack while leading a tour group through the big room. They said it was quick, that he didn't suffer. I like to think he died doing what he loved, surrounded by that ancient darkness he'd spent his life exploring. I joined the Park Service the next year, worked my way through various postings, and ended up in Alaska almost by accident. A temporary assignment turned permanent, and I discovered that I'd found my place. The darkness here is different from the caves, though. In the caves, the darkness is contained, bounded by rock walls and mapped passages. You can turn on a light and see where you are. Out here, the darkness is endless. It stretches to the horizon and beyond, and your light is just a tiny bubble of false security in an ocean of black. It's humbling in a way that makes you understand your place in the world. I mention all this because I want you to understand that I'm not some city person who panics at shadows. I've spent years in the Alaskan wilderness, in conditions that would terrify most people. I've been charged by bears, stalked by wolves, caught in whiteout so complete I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. I've spent nights at -60, when your breath freezes before it leaves your lungs, and any exposed skin develops frostbite in under a minute. I've seen the northern lights do things I can't explain, and I've heard sounds in the forest that don't match any animal I know. But I'd never been afraid. Not really afraid. Not deep in your bones, terrified. Not until that December night. I was on a routine overnight patrol heading from the Eagle Station to a remote cabin about 40 miles north where a trapper had reported seeing an unusually large wolf pack. The report had come in 3 days earlier. Old Frank Hutchins, who'd been trapping this territory for 30 years, said he'd counted at least 15 animals moving together, which was unusual. Wolf packs in this region typically run 6 to 8 members, sometimes 10 in a good year. 15 suggested either 2 packs traveling together, which almost never happens, or something else was going on. I'd spent the morning preparing for the run, checked my snowmobile thoroughly. Oil, coolant, track tension, belt condition. Packed my emergency gear, space blanket, fire starter, extra fuel, high-calorie food bars, water in an insulated container. My rifle, a .308 Winchester, cleaned and loaded. Spare ammunition. Flares. My GPS unit with fresh batteries and the route pre-programmed. Satellite phone fully charged. Emergency beacon tested and ready. Radio with extra battery packs. First aid kit. Avalanche beacon even though the terrain on this route didn't typically present avalanche risk. You pack for the worst case scenario, because out here, the worst case scenario can kill you in less than an hour. I'd also checked the weather forecast. Clear skies, no storms expected. Temperature steady at -35 to -40. Good traveling weather as far as winter in the Arctic goes. I'd made this run dozens of times. Knew every mile of the route, every potential hazard, every emergency shelter location. It should have been routine. I left the Eagle Station around 3 p.m., which was already full dark. The brief twilight we get in December had faded by 2:30. The station manager, Bill Crawford, watched me load the last of my gear and said what he always said. Check in when you get there. I nodded, started the machine, and headed out into the night. The first hour was perfect. The snowmobile ran smoothly, the headlight cutting a strong beam through the darkness, illuminating the trail ahead. The route followed a frozen river for the first 20 miles. The ice was solid, at least 3 feet thick this late in the season, safe as pavement. The temperature was actually comfortable, warmer than it had been all week, and there was no wind. The stars were out, brilliant and cold, and I could see the faint green glow of aurora on the northern horizon. I stopped at the 10-mile mark to check my bearings and adjust my gear. Everything was running perfectly. I took a moment to just stand there in the darkness, listening to the silence. This is what I loved about the job, these moments of absolute quiet, where the only sound is your own breathing and the occasional crack of ice adjusting to temperature changes. No human noise, no machines except my own, no light pollution, just you in the wilderness. I should have known that kind of perfection doesn't last. The route left the river at mile 20, cutting through a narrow valley between 2 ridge lines. This section was always trickier. The trail wound through scattered spruce forests, and the terrain was more varied, with small gullies and rises that required careful navigation. I slowed down to about 25 miles per hour, keeping my focus on the trail ahead. That's when the temperature dropped. Not gradually, suddenly. I watched the gauge on my handlebar drop from -35 to -43 in the space of maybe 2 minutes. The air took on that particular quality it gets at extreme cold, where it feels thick and resistant, like you're moving through something denser than normal atmosphere. My breath, which had been forming small clouds of ice crystals, now froze instantly, creating a haze around my face mask. I'd experienced sudden temperature drops before, cold air settling into valleys, atmospheric inversion layers, various meteorological phenomena that create microclimates. It was unusual, but not alarming. I checked my gear, made sure all my exposed skin was covered, and continued on. I was about 25 miles out, deep into the valley between the ridgelines when I first heard it. The engine on a snowmobile is loud, maybe 80 decibels or more at speed. There's no way you should be able to hear anything over it, especially not subtle sounds. The machine creates a cocoon of noise that drowns out the world. But I heard this clearly, impossibly clearly, like it was right next to me, like someone had put headphones on me and was playing the sound directly into my ears, the crunch of snow under a footstep. I slowed down instinctively, my mind trying to process what I'd heard. Could it have been a piece of ice kicked up by the track? A chunk of frozen snow hitting the cowling? The machine settling under my weight? I ran through the possibilities, but none of them fit. I've been riding snowmobiles for 15 years, and I know every sound they make. This wasn't the machine. I slowed to maybe 15 miles per hour, and as I did, I heard it again. Crunch. Then another crunch. Steady, rhythmic, matching my reduced speed exactly. Like someone was jogging alongside me in the snow, keeping perfect pace. My first thought was that I'd picked up a running wolf or caribou, something pacing the machine out of curiosity or territorial behavior. It happens sometimes. Wolves, especially, will sometimes run alongside vehicles, testing them, trying to figure out what they are. But wolves make different sounds when they run. Their gait is uneven, 4 legs creating a complex rhythm. This was steady, bilateral, human footsteps. I stopped the machine completely and killed the engine. The sudden silence was overwhelming. That particular quality of quiet you only get in deep winter when the snow absorbs all sound. I sat there, listening, my breath forming thick clouds in the headlight beam. My heart was beating faster than normal, though I wasn't sure why. Nothing had happened yet. Just a sound. I counted to 30 in my head, listening with complete focus. The machine ticked as the engine cooled. The night air made tiny crystalline sounds as moisture froze. And underneath it all, nothing. Complete silence. I told myself I'd imagined it, that the isolation was getting to me, that my mind had created a pattern out of random engine noise. It happens. The human brain is wired to find patterns, even when they don't exist. Especially in environments where we're alone, where we're vulnerable, where our primate hindbrain remembers what it means to be hunted. I started the machine again and accelerated, pushing it faster now, wanting to get through this valley and back into more open terrain. I brought it up to 30 miles per hour, the engine roaring, the track throwing up a rooster tail of snow behind me. But within a minute, I heard it again. Footsteps in snow, matching my speed exactly, coming from my right side. Not just 1 or 2 steps, but continuous, sustained, keeping perfect pace as I accelerated from 15 to 20 to 30 miles per hour. The sound was crystal clear despite the engine noise, distinct and impossible to ignore. I turned my head to look, even though I knew it was pointless in the darkness. My headlight illuminated maybe 30 feet of terrain on either side, and beyond that was just empty black. But I looked anyway, searching for movement, for any sign of what was making that sound. Nothing. Just the snow-covered ground and scattered black spruce, their shadows dancing in the headlight beam as I passed. I pulled the snowmobile to a stop again and grabbed my spotlight, a powerful handheld unit I keep for scanning terrain at night. It puts out maybe 2,000 lumens, enough to illuminate an area the size of a football field. I aimed it to the right where the sounds were coming from and swept the area in a wide arc. Nothing. No tracks, no animals, no people. Just undisturbed snow stretching away into the darkness between scattered black spruce. The snow was smooth, unbroken, no depressions or marks of any kind. If something had been running alongside me, it should have left tracks. Even a bird hopping on the surface would leave marks. But there was nothing. I kept the spotlight on for a full minute, scanning slowly, looking for any sign of movement or disturbance. The light picked out every detail: individual snow crystals, the texture of tree bark, the shadows cast by branches. If there was something out there, I should be able to see it. But there was nothing. I turned the spotlight off and started moving again, and instantly, the footsteps resumed. Crunch, crunch, crunch. So clear, so distinct, like someone was jogging alongside me in the snow, keeping perfect pace, their feet hitting the ground in perfect rhythm with my machine's movement. This is where I should explain something about fear and rationalization. The human mind will do almost anything to avoid accepting something that doesn't fit its understanding of how the world works. When confronted with something impossible, the brain will create increasingly elaborate explanations to maintain the illusion that everything makes sense. I know this because I could feel my mind doing it in real time. Maybe it was some acoustic phenomenon, I told myself. Sound bouncing off the valley walls in a weird way, creating the illusion of footsteps. Maybe my engine was making an unusual noise that I'd never heard before. Some mechanical issue that sounded like footsteps. Maybe I was more tired than I thought, and my brain was creating patterns out of random sound, filling in details that weren't there. I tried to believe these explanations. I wanted to believe them, because the alternative, that something was actually out there, running alongside me in -40 weather without leaving tracks, without showing up in my spotlight, without making any sound except footsteps, was impossible. I decided to test it more systematically. I stopped the machine but left the engine running, idling. The engine noise was steady, a low rumble at maybe 60 decibels. I sat very still and listened. The footsteps had stopped when I stopped, just like before. I waited, counting seconds, listening to the engine idle and the night air freeze around me. 10 seconds, 20, 30. Then they started again, but different this time. They weren't matching my movement anymore because I wasn't moving. They were circling. I could hear them moving from my right side, passing behind me, then moving around to my left side. Slow and deliberate, maybe one step every 2 seconds. Walking, not running. Like whatever was making them was taking its time now, examining me, studying me. The sound made a complete circuit around the snowmobile, always at the same distance, maybe 15 or 20 feet out. Then it stopped at my right side again, exactly where it had started. My hand was shaking as I reached for my rifle and pulled it from the scabbard mounted on the machine. I have excellent night vision after years of winter work. It's one of the adaptations you develop when you spend this much time in darkness. My pupils were fully dilated, and I could see reasonably well in the ambient starlight. If something was out there, if something solid was making those sounds, I should be able to see it, or at least see its breath condensing in the cold air. At -40, every living thing creates a visible cloud with every exhalation. But I saw nothing. The area around my machine was empty. I decided to pull out my thermal camera. It's a piece of equipment we use for wildlife surveys, detecting animals by their heat signature. Anything warm-blooded shows up bright white against the cold background. I powered it on and scanned the area where the footsteps were coming from. The screen was empty, no heat signatures. The landscape was a uniform blue-black, showing the cold ground and vegetation. Even my snowmobile barely registered. Its engine heat had dissipated quickly in the extreme cold. But the footsteps hadn't stopped. They were right beside me now, so close I should be able to reach out and touch whatever was making them. I spun around with the thermal camera, scanning in a full circle. Nothing. Not a single heat source anywhere except my own body. I've been in the wilderness long enough to know when something is wrong, when your instincts are screaming at you to get out, when every fiber of your being is telling you that you're in danger. This was one of those times. My hands were shaking, not from cold. I was dressed properly and the handlebars were heated, but from adrenaline, from fear, from the primal recognition that something was very, very wrong. I holstered the thermal camera, secured my rifle back in its scabbard, and opened the throttle hard, accelerating as fast as the terrain would safely allow. The engine screamed, the track bit into the snow, and I shot forward up the valley. The footsteps accelerated with me. I want to be very clear about what I experienced next, because even now, months later, I have trouble believing it happened. As the snowmobile's engine screamed and I hit 30, then 40, then 50 miles per hour, those footsteps kept pace. Perfect rhythm, never falling behind, never breaking stride. Always right there beside me in the darkness, matching my speed impossibly. I should mention something about sound and speed that makes this even more impossible. At 50 miles per hour on a snowmobile in deep winter, the engine noise is absolutely deafening. We're talking 85, maybe 90 decibels. The wind roar adds another layer. At that speed, the wind chill is somewhere around -70, and the air rushing past your helmet creates a constant roaring sound. You're wearing a heavy insulated hood over your helmet, a face mask, ear protection. You're essentially cocooned in noise. You shouldn't be able to hear anything subtle. You shouldn't be able to hear someone talking right next to you, let alone the sound of footsteps in snow. It should be physically impossible, but I could hear them. They were as clear as if I was standing still in complete silence. Crunch, 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 steady, rhythmic, tireless, keeping pace at 50 miles per hour like it was nothing, like the speed didn't matter, like physics didn't apply to whatever was making that sound. I glanced at my GPS. I was still 15 miles from the cabin, and the terrain ahead was getting rougher. The trail wound through a series of gullies and over several small ridges, terrain that required careful navigation. I'd have to slow down or risk flipping the machine, breaking through into a hidden creek bed, hitting a buried rock or log. At 50 miles per hour in the dark, a single mistake could be fatal. But slowing down meant spending more time with whatever this was. And I didn't want to do that. Every instinct I had was telling me to get away, to put distance between myself and the source of those footsteps, even though I couldn't see anything, couldn't identify any actual threat. I compromised, bringing my speed down to around 35, navigating by GPS and the cone of my headlight. The trail was visible enough, a packed track through the snow that other machines had followed, but at this speed in the dark, I had maybe 2 seconds to react to any obstacle. My focus narrowed to just the immediate terrain ahead, my hands tight on the handlebars, my body tense and ready to respond. The footsteps continued, sometimes on my right, sometimes on my left, occasionally dropping back behind me before catching up again. Once, and this made my blood run cold, I could swear I heard them directly in front of me, leading the way, the sounds coming from where my headlight beam illuminated fresh snow. But that was impossible. I was traveling through unbroken powder, and there were no tracks ahead of me, no signs that anything had passed this way. At the 10-mile mark, I allowed myself to think that maybe I was going to make it. Maybe whatever this was would stop at the tree line, or lose interest, or simply vanish the way it had appeared. Maybe I could get to the cabin, get inside, lock the door, and wait until morning to figure out what had happened. That's when my radio crackled to life. Unit 19, respond. It was dispatch, but the signal was weak and distorted. I grabbed the handset, grateful for human contact even through static. This is Unit 19, I read you. What's your traffic? Unit 19, your beacon, activated. My emergency beacon? I hadn't touched it. I reached back to check the unit mounted on the rear of my snowmobile and felt my stomach drop. The beacon was on, transmitting, but I hadn't activated it. Dispatch, I did not activate my emergency beacon. Repeat, beacon activation was not initiated by me. Unit 19, confirm your position, showing movement. I'm en route to the North Fork cabin about 10 miles out. Everything is fine. I'll deactivate the beacon. Unit 19, thermal, picking up. The radio dissolved into static and then went dead. I tried to raise them again, but got nothing. Whatever brief atmospheric condition had allowed that transmission was gone. I reached back and switched off the emergency beacon, then checked my satellite phone. It was working fine, showing a strong signal. I could call for help if I needed to. That was reassuring, at least. The footsteps were still there, constant and unchanging. I'd been listening to them for almost an hour now, and they hadn't varied in rhythm or intensity. Whatever was making them had endless endurance. I came over a rise and saw lights in the distance. The cabin, finally. It was maybe half a mile away, its windows glowing warm yellow in the darkness, and I've never been so relieved to see a man-made structure in my life. Civilization, safety, walls, and a door and a lock. I accelerated toward it, the snowmobile's engine roaring, and the footsteps stopped. Just like that. Silence except for my engine and the wind. I slowed down, listening, straining to hear anything over the mechanical noise, but they were gone completely. I stopped about 100 yards from the cabin and killed the engine, sitting in the sudden quiet and listening with all my focus. My heart was still pounding, adrenaline still flooding my system, but the night was silent. Whatever had been following me was gone. I sat there for maybe 2 minutes, just listening and watching, letting my breathing slow down, trying to process what I'd just experienced. The rational part of my brain was already trying to explain it away. Acoustic anomalies, engine sounds, exhaustion-induced auditory hallucinations. The other part, the deeper part that still remembered what it meant to be prey, wasn't buying any of those explanations. The cabin looked normal, peaceful. Smoke was coming from the chimney, which meant someone had a fire going. But the windows were dark. No lantern light, no movement. That was odd. The trappers should have been there, should have had lights on. It was after midnight, but most people don't go to bed this early in remote cabins. There's not much else to do but read or work on gear by lamplight. I started the machine again and rode the last 100 yards to the cabin, parking my snowmobile next to another one that was already there. Probably Frank Hutchins' machine, the trapper who'd called in the wolf report. I killed my engine and sat for a moment, reluctant to get off, reluctant to lose that sense of mobility. I dismounted and immediately noticed something odd. The other snowmobile was covered in a thin layer of frost. Not unusual. Machines frost up quickly in this cold, but this one looked like it had been sitting here for days, maybe longer. The metal was uniformly white with ice crystals, and snow had drifted up against the skis and track. This machine hadn't been started in a while. I approached the cabin door, pulling off my glove to knock. The wood was solid under my knuckles, the sound loud in the quiet night. I waited, expecting to hear movement inside, footsteps approaching the door. Nothing. I knocked again, harder this time. "Hello? It's David Ortiz, Alaska Wildlife Services. Anyone home?" Still nothing. I tried the handle. The door was unlocked, and it swung open easily, revealing darkness inside. I pulled out my flashlight and stepped into the cabin, calling out again. "Frank, it's Officer Ortiz." The cabin was empty, but it was warm. Not just a little warm, actually heated, like someone had been keeping the fire going. I swept my light around and saw the wood stove in the corner. It was burning, flames visible through the small window in the door, fresh wood stacked beside it. But no one was there. I checked the cabin systematically. One room, maybe 15 by 20 feet, a cot in one corner with a sleeping bag rolled up on it, a small table with 2 chairs, shelves with supplies, canned food, coffee, first aid kit, a camp stove. Hanging from pegs on the wall were various items of clothing and gear. Everything looked normal, well maintained, recently used. On the table, I found a mug of coffee. I touched it carefully, still warm, not hot, but warm enough that it had been poured within the last hour or so. Next to it was a notebook, open to a page of handwriting. I recognized Frank's scrawl. I'd seen his reports before. The entry was dated today, with a timestamp of 10:47 p.m., less than 2 hours ago. Wolves circling again tonight. Count at least 20 now, maybe more. They're not acting normal, staying just outside the light, watching. One of them came up to the window and looked in. Not like a wolf looks, like a person looks. Need to report this tomorrow. That was the last entry. The pen was lying next to the notebook, like Frank had just set it down. I went outside and did a thorough check of the area, using my spotlight to scan in all directions. Frank's snowmobile was the only other machine here besides mine. There were no tracks leading away from the cabin, none at all. The snow around the structure was smooth and undisturbed, except for my own footprints approaching the door. I radioed dispatch, reported the situation. Empty cabin, fresh fire, signs of very recent occupation, but no person. They told me Frank had actually left 2 days ago, called away by a family emergency. They'd sent me a message to cancel the patrol, but I must not have received it before I left. There shouldn't be anyone at this cabin, but someone had been here, recently, within the last 2 hours. I went back inside, my unease growing. I checked everything again, looking for any sign of what might have happened. The sleeping bag was rolled up neatly, tied with cord. I untied it and found it was still slightly warm inside, body heat not yet fully dissipated. Someone had been sleeping in it within the last few hours. I was alone in a remote cabin, 40 miles from the nearest station, with evidence that someone had been here very recently but no sign of where they'd gone. And outside, in the darkness, something had followed me for miles, matching my speed impossibly, leaving no tracks, showing no heat signature. I made a decision. I was staying in the cabin tonight. It was too dangerous to travel in the dark after what I'd experienced, but I wasn't sleeping. I dragged the table in front of the door and piled some gear on it so I'd hear if anyone tried to come in. I kept my rifle loaded and within arm's reach. I sat in one of the chairs facing the door and waited for morning. The fire burned steadily in the stove. The cabin was quiet except for the pop and crackle of burning wood. I kept my flashlight on, the beam pointed at the door, and I watched. Around 3 a.m. I heard them again. The footsteps, outside, circling the cabin. Slow and deliberate, crunching in the snow. I grabbed my rifle and moved to the window, looking out into the darkness. I couldn't see anything. The darkness outside was absolute, and my flashlight beam didn't reach far enough. But I could hear them clearly. Footsteps in snow, maybe 10 or 15 feet from the cabin wall, making a slow circuit around the structure. I stayed at the window, rifle ready, listening to those footsteps circle the cabin over and over. They must have made 20 complete circuits, maybe more, always at the same distance, always at the same pace. Then, sometime around 4 a.m., they stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the footsteps had been. I stood there waiting, listening for any sound, any indication of where whatever was making them had gone. But there was nothing, just the wind and the crackle of the fire and my own breathing. I didn't sleep. I sat in that chair, rifle across my lap, watching the door until weak daylight started filtering through the windows around 10 a.m. That's the thing about December in Alaska. You get maybe 3 hours of twilight that passes for day, and that's it. but it was enough light to see by, enough to make me feel like maybe I could safely go outside. I moved the table away from the door and stepped out into the cold. The temperature had dropped further overnight. My thermometer showed -47, cold enough that the air felt thick and resistant. The sky was clear, though, that particular pale blue-gray you get during Arctic winter twilight. I looked at my snowmobile first. It was fine, no signs of tampering or damage. Then I looked at the snow around it, and my blood went cold. There were footprints, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, human-sized and barefoot, pressed deep into the snow. They formed patterns around my machine, circles and spirals and figure eights, overlapping and chaotic, like something had been dancing around it during the night. But here's what made it impossible. Those footprints didn't come from anywhere. They didn't trail off into the wilderness. There was no path leading to them, no tracks showing how whatever made them had approached. They just existed, a complex pattern of prints in the snow with no beginning and no end, as if they'd simply appeared there. I photographed everything, took measurements, documented every detail I could. The prints were roughly size 11 or 12, with clear toe and arch impressions. The depth suggested significant weight, at least 180 pounds. But the stride length was wrong for a human walk. Each print was about 4 feet from the next, which would require an impossibly long gait. And they were barefoot. In -47-degree weather, something had been walking around barefoot all night, leaving clear, distinct prints in the snow. I spent an hour examining the area, looking for any rational explanation. Could it be wind patterns creating depressions that looked like prints? No, the prints were too well defined, too anatomically correct. Could it be some kind of animal track I didn't recognize? No, these were clearly humanoid feet. 5 toes, distinct heel and arch. Could someone be playing an elaborate prank? No, there was no way to create this pattern without leaving approach tracks. And besides, who would do that out here? 40 miles from nowhere. I had no explanation. I had only evidence of something impossible. I checked the area around the cabin, too, where I'd heard the footsteps circling during the night. More prints, forming a perfect circle about 15 feet from the cabin wall. Dozens of them, overlapping, the snow compressed into a hard-packed path where something had walked around and around and around. I took more photos, more measurements, then packed up my gear and prepared to leave. I wasn't staying here another night. Whatever this place was, whatever was happening here, I wanted no part of it. I took photos, documented everything, and called it in. The official explanation was some kind of wind pattern creating depressions that looked like prints, even though anyone who looked at the photos could see that made no sense. I didn't argue. What could I say that wouldn't sound insane? That something invisible had followed me for 20 miles. That it could run at 50 miles per hour without tiring. That it had left hundreds of barefoot prints in -40 weather. That it could somehow move without showing up on thermal imaging. I filed my report, sanitized and professional, leaving out the parts that couldn't be explained. Possible auditory hallucination due to engine noise and isolation. Unusual snow formations around the cabin. No sign of the trapper, cabin secure. Routine patrol completed. But I knew the truth, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. The ride back to the Eagle Station was uneventful, thank God. Daylight, clear weather, no sounds except my machine and the wind. I kept checking behind me, kept scanning the terrain on either side, but there was nothing. Whatever had been out there the night before was gone, or at least wasn't following me anymore. Bill Crawford was waiting when I got back, concerned because I'd been out of contact for longer than planned. I told him the basics. Trapper gone, family emergency. Spent the night at the cabin, everything fine. He didn't push for details, just nodded and told me to get some rest. I should have let it go. I should have chalked it up to exhaustion, stress, isolation, all the things that can make your mind play tricks on you in the wilderness. But I couldn't, because deep down, I knew what I'd experienced was real. I've done that route maybe a dozen times since then, but I've changed my procedure. I only travel during daylight hours now, never at night. I inform dispatch of my exact route and check in every hour. I carry extra batteries for everything, backup GPS units, redundant communication systems. I'm prepared for anything, every possible emergency. But it doesn't matter, because 3 weeks ago, in broad daylight at 2 p.m. with the weak winter sun barely clearing the horizon, I heard them again, those footsteps matching my speed, coming from right beside my snowmobile where nothing existed. I checked my thermal camera. Nothing, just the cold landscape, uniform and empty. I checked the snow, no tracks, not a single mark except my own machine's trail. I stopped my machine and sat there in the cold daylight, and the footsteps circled me again, slow and deliberate, just like they had that first night. I haven't told anyone about this most recent incident. What would I say? That it's still happening, that whatever followed me that December night hasn't stopped, that it's still out there, still keeping pace, still circling. I've been thinking about requesting a transfer to a different territory, maybe something closer to civilization, maybe something where I'm not alone for days at a time. But I don't think it matters. I don't think distance will help. Because last night I was in my house in Eagle, 50 miles from that valley where it started, and at 3 a.m. I woke to the sound of footsteps outside my bedroom window. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Steady, rhythmic, patient. The same footsteps I'd heard that night, the same rhythm, the same impossible clarity. I turned on every light in my house and grabbed my rifle. I went outside in my thermal underwear and boots, the cold biting at my exposed skin, and checked the area around my house with my spotlight and thermal camera. Fresh snow had fallen that evening, covering everything in about 6 inches of powder. Outside my bedroom window, pressed into that fresh snow, were footprints. Barefoot human prints, size 11 or 12, pressed deep into the snow despite the -30 cold. And this time, they didn't just circle, they walked right up to my window and stopped. The prints were positioned as if someone had been standing there, looking in at me while I slept. I called dispatch, reported possible prowler, but by the time anyone could get to my house, 2 hours had passed and more snow had fallen, covering the prints. The officer who responded took my statement, looked around, found nothing. He gave me that look, the one that says he thinks I'm stressed, maybe drinking too much, maybe losing it from too much time alone in the wilderness. Maybe he's right. Maybe I am losing it. But I know what I heard, and I know what I saw, like whatever makes them was looking in. They called it in around 11 p.m. on a Thursday. Missing campers at Bear Creek, about 30 miles west of my station. The call came from a hiker who'd found the camp abandoned, tents still standing, gear still there, but no people. In Alaska, that's the kind of thing you take seriously. People don't just leave their camps intact and wander off into the wilderness. Something happens. Injury, animal attack, disorientation from hypothermia, and when it does, every hour counts. I'm Jennifer Kowalski, been with Alaska Wildlife Services for 8 years, working the Denali Periphery region. It's beautiful country, the kind that looks like a postcard, but it's also unforgiving. We lose a few people every year to various causes: falls, exposure, bear encounters, river crossings gone wrong. Most of the time we find them alive. Sometimes we don't find them at all. I grew up in Wisconsin, in the flatlands where the biggest danger was maybe hitting a deer with your car or getting lost in a cornfield. Nothing prepared me for Alaska. I came up here right out of college with the Park Service, assigned to Denali as a seasonal ranger, and I fell in love with the place immediately. The scale of it, the rawness, the sense that humans are just visitors here and not very important ones. After 2 seasons, I transferred to Wildlife Services and never looked back. My territory covers about 400 square miles of mixed terrain, mountains, valleys, river systems, taiga forest. In summer, it's accessible by truck and ATV. In winter, it's snowmobile only and some areas become completely impassable. I patrol solo most of the time, checking on hunting camps, monitoring wildlife populations, responding to calls like this one. It's good work, important work, but it takes a toll. The isolation gets to you after a while. You start having conversations with yourself, giving personalities to the ravens that follow your vehicle, seeing patterns in things that are probably just random, or maybe not random. That's what this story is about. The things you see that you can't explain, the moments when the wilderness shows you something that doesn't fit into any manual or training protocol. I've had a few of those moments in my 8 years up here. Small things, mostly. Strange tracks that disappear mid-trail. Sounds in the forest that don't match any animal I know. The feeling of being watched when you're absolutely certain you're alone. But Bear Creek was different. Bear Creek was the moment I understood that there are things in the Alaskan wilderness that we don't have names for, things that operate by rules we don't understand. And once you've seen them, once you've made that contact, they don't let go. I assembled my gear quickly. Emergency medical kit with trauma supplies, rope and climbing equipment, signal flares, handheld radio and spare batteries, GPS unit, rifle with extra ammunition, 3 days of emergency food and water in case I got stuck out there, space blanket, fire starter kit, first aid manual, satellite phone. Everything went into my pack in a specific order, muscle memory from years of doing this. The forecast was decent. Clear skies, temperature around 20 degrees Fahrenheit, no storm systems moving in for at least 48 hours. Good searching weather as far as Alaska goes. I called for backup from the state troopers, but the nearest unit was in Healy, at least 4 hours out even in good conditions. I couldn't wait that long. If the campers were injured and exposure was a factor, 4 hours could mean the difference between rescue and recovery. Hypothermia kills fast up here, even at 20 degrees. You get wet, the temperature drops, you stop moving, you've got maybe 2 hours before you're in serious trouble. The hiker who'd called it in had given dispatch decent directions. Bear Creek Campground, north side, about 8 miles in from the logging road terminus. I knew the area reasonably well. It was a popular spot in summer for backcountry camping, with good fishing and relatively easy access. In October, though, with the season changing and the first snows already dusting the high peaks, it was pretty isolated. Most people had cleared out weeks ago. I took my truck as far as the logging road would allow, the headlights cutting through the darkness as I wound through dense spruce forest. The road was rough, barely maintained, more like 2 tracks through the trees than anything you'd call a proper road. Fall in Alaska means mud, lots of it, and my tires churned through deep ruts, the truck rocking and sliding as I navigated the worst sections. At the road terminus, I switched to my ATV, a heavy-duty four-wheeler with a cargo rack and spotlight. The trail to Bear Creek was rough even by Alaska standards, winding through dense forest that got thicker the further in you went. Spruce and birch pressed in on both sides, their branches scraping against my helmet as I passed. The headlights on the ATV cut through the darkness, illuminating a tunnel of trees, their shadows dancing and twisting in the beam. The forest was quiet, too quiet. Normally you'd hear owls, maybe a fox yipping in the distance, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. But tonight there was nothing, just the mechanical growl of my engine and the crunch of my tires on the trail. I've learned to pay attention to that kind of quiet. It usually means a predator nearby. something big enough that the small animals have gone to ground. I stopped twice to check my GPS and listen, killing the engine and sitting in the sudden silence. The first time, I heard what might have been a wolf howl in the distance, faint and uncertain. The second time, nothing at all. Just the whisper of wind through the trees and the occasional creak of branches settling. I reached Bear Creek around 1 a.m., maybe a little later. The creek itself was running full, swollen with recent rain, making a constant gurgling rush that filled the night air. The campsite was easy to find. 3 tents set up in a clearing about 50 yards from the water, a fire ring with cold ashes, and a properly secured bear-proof food container hanging from a tree branch. Everything looked orderly, organized, the kind of setup you'd expect from experienced campers who knew what they were doing. I killed my engine and called out, "Hello, Alaska Wildlife Services, anyone here?" My voice echoed off the trees and faded into silence. I listened for a response, any sound of movement, but heard nothing except the creek gurgling in the background and the whisper of wind through the pines. The sound of water was constant here, a white noise that would make it difficult to hear anything subtle. Voices, footsteps, even someone calling for help from a distance. I dismounted from the ATV and pulled out my flashlight, scanning the campsite carefully before approaching. Everything looked orderly from a distance, but I've learned to look for the small details, the things that don't fit the pattern. A tent with the flap open when it should be closed. Gear scattered in panic rather than arranged neatly. Signs of a struggle or sudden departure. But I didn't see any of that. This looked like a normal, well-organized camp. I approached the first tent cautiously, announcing myself again. "Alaska Wildlife Services Officer Kowalski. I'm here to help. If anyone is inside, please respond." Nothing. I crouched down and unzipped the flap slowly, half expecting someone to be inside, maybe injured or sick, unable to respond. But the tent was empty. 2 sleeping bags, partially unzipped like someone had gotten out of them recently and hadn't bothered to zip them back up. Personal items scattered around in that particular way people arrange their stuff when they're comfortable, when they're planning to stay a while. Books stacked neatly in a corner. A water bottle, half full, sitting on top of a backpack. Some clothing folded and placed beside sleeping bags. A phone sat on top of one of the sleeping bags, a newer model smartphone in a protective case. I picked it up carefully and pressed the power button. Nothing. Dead battery. I set it back down exactly where I'd found it. The second tent showed the same pattern. 2 sleeping bags, partially unzipped. Personal items arranged as if the occupants had just stepped away for a moment. Another phone, also dead. A paperback novel laid open and face down. The spine creased at page 167, like someone had been reading in their sleeping bag and set it down, expecting to pick it back up in a few minutes. A pair of reading glasses sat on top of a stuff sack, folded neatly. The third tent had only 1 sleeping bag, but it showed the same signs of recent occupation. A journal lay open on the sleeping bag, and I crouched down to read the last entry by flashlight. The handwriting was neat, careful, the kind of writing you do when you're keeping a record you want to be able to read later. Day 3 at Bear Creek. Weather perfect, fishing terrible. Haven't caught anything worth keeping. Saw a moose this morning across the creek, big bull with a full rack. Beautiful animal, just stood there watching us for maybe 10 minutes before wandering off. Sarah thinks we should hike up to the overlook tomorrow if the weather holds. Mike's worried about bears, but I told him we haven't seen any sign, no tracks or scat anywhere. The only weird thing is how quiet it gets at night. Like everything stops making noise at the same time all at once. Even the creek seems quieter, though that's probably impossible. Just my imagination, I'm sure. That was the last entry, dated yesterday. The pen was lying in the crease of the journal, blue ink, like the writer had just set it down mid-thought. I backed out of the tent carefully and stood up, looking around the campsite with new attention. Something about that journal entry bothered me. How quiet it gets at night. Everything stops making noise at the same time. I'd been in the wilderness long enough to know that unnatural silence usually means something. Predator nearby usually. Something big enough that the small animals go quiet and still, trying not to draw attention. I checked the fire ring next. It was in the center of the clearing. A proper ring of rocks arranged in a circle with the ashes of multiple fires inside. I crouched down and felt the ashes carefully with the back of my hand. Stone cold. No residual heat at all. At least 24 hours old, maybe longer. The wood pile beside the fire was untouched, several days' worth of split wood stacked neatly. If the campers had left voluntarily, planning to come back, they would have made sure the fire was completely out, scattered the ashes, covered them with dirt. This looked more like they'd walked away from a dead fire and simply never returned. The third tent had only one sleeping bag, but it showed the same pattern. Everything present except the person. I checked the fire ring. The ashes were old, at least a day, maybe two. The wood pile beside it was untouched. If the campers had left voluntarily, they would have scattered the fire properly, made sure everything was safe. This looked more like they'd stepped away expecting to come back. I found their vehicles parked at the trailhead where I'd left my ATV. 2 cars, both locked, keys presumably with the missing campers. 5 people total, based on the sleeping bags and the arrangement of gear. I radioed in my findings to dispatch, keeping my voice calm and professional, even though something about this whole situation was making me increasingly uneasy. Dispatch, this is Unit 23. I'm at the Bear Creek campsite. No sign of the campers, but all their gear is here. Tents, sleeping bags, food, vehicles. Looks like they left expecting to return. Copy that, Unit 23. Backup ETA is approximately 90 minutes. Do you want to hold position or begin a search? I looked around at the dark forest surrounding the campsite, listening to that constant rush of creek water. 90 minutes was a long time to wait if someone was injured out there, but searching alone in the dark, in unfamiliar terrain, came with its own risks. I'm going to do a perimeter search, see if I can find any tracks indicating which direction they went. We'll stay within audible range of the campsite. Copy. Check in every 30 minutes. I grabbed my spotlight and started walking the perimeter of the camp in a systematic pattern, scanning the ground for footprints. The soil here was soft, a mix of dirt and pine needles and decaying vegetation, the kind of surface that should show tracks clearly. And I found plenty. Boot prints heading down to the creek, others circling the fire pit, a few going toward the tree line where the forest started. But something was wrong with the pattern. The tracks didn't lead away from camp in any clear direction. They seemed to wander, overlapping and confused, like the campers had been walking in circles. I followed one set of prints, appeared to be hiking boots, size 9 or 10, and watched as it made a circuit around the fire ring, then headed toward the creek, then doubled back, then went toward the forest edge, then back to the fire ring again. It was the kind of track pattern you'd see from someone who was disoriented, maybe hypothermic or injured, their judgment impaired. But all 5 people at the same time? That didn't make sense. I was kneeling beside a particularly clear boot print, trying to determine how fresh it was, when I noticed something else. Scattered among the human tracks were other impressions. Not boot prints. These were different, deeper, pressed into the soft soil with considerable weight. I focused my spotlight on the clearest one. It was roughly circular, maybe 5 inches across, with what looked like claw marks at one end. Bear print, maybe. But the shape was wrong. Bears have 5 toes on their front paws, and you can usually see all of them in a clear print. This just showed 3 distinct marks, and they were arranged in a way that didn't match any bear track I'd ever seen. I took photos with my phone, documented the size and depth, and continued my perimeter search. I found more of the strange tracks scattered throughout the area but concentrated near the forest edge, as if whatever made them had been pacing back and forth along the tree line. That's when I found the radio. I picked it up and examined it. Civilian band 2-way radio, nothing special. The kind you can buy at any outdoor store for maybe $40. The power was on, set to channel 7, which was a common frequency for backcountry communication. The battery indicator showed about half charge, enough for several more hours of use. I keyed the mic, keeping my voice calm and clear. This is Alaska Wildlife Services Officer Kowalski. If anyone can hear this, please respond. Static. I waited 30 seconds, listening to the white noise hiss from the speaker, then tried again. This is Officer Kowalski with Alaska Wildlife Services. I'm at the Bear Creek campsite. If you're receiving this transmission, please respond with your location. Nothing but static. I was about to set it down and continue my search when it crackled to life. The voice was faint, barely audible over the static, distorted and distant. Help. My pulse quickened. Someone was out there. Someone with a radio, someone who needed help. I keyed the mic immediately. This is Officer Kowalski. I copy your transmission. What's your location? How many are with you? Creek. Can't. The voice cut in and out, fragmented by static. I couldn't tell if it was male or female, couldn't determine age or condition. Just that one word clearly, creek. You're at the creek? Bear Creek? Can you give me more specific information? Are you injured? A longer burst of static, and then another word that made my skin crawl. Watching. I felt the hair rise on the back of my neck. Someone is watching you. Are you in danger? I need you to give me your specific location so I can help you. More static. I waited, watching the radio's display, hoping for another transmission. 30 seconds passed. A minute, 2 minutes. The radio remained silent except for the background hiss. I tried transmitting again, using different phrasings, asking yes or no questions that could be answered with simple keying clicks, standard protocols for situations where voice communication is difficult. But I got nothing back. Whoever had been on the other end was gone, or couldn't respond, or had turned off their radio. I clipped the radio to my belt, keeping it on and monitoring Channel 7, and made a decision. The campers had mentioned the creek in their transmission. I'd follow the creek downstream, see if I could find any signs of them. Most lost or disoriented hikers tend to follow water, reasoning that it will lead them to civilization eventually. It's not always the best strategy, but it's what people do. I grabbed my gear and started walking, keeping my spotlight trained on the ground, looking for tracks. The trail beside the creek was rough, barely a trail at all, more like a narrow path worn by animals coming down to drink. Spruce and birch pressed in on both sides, their branches forming a canopy overhead that blocked what little starlight there was. My spotlight beam became a tunnel of light through darkness, illuminating maybe 20 feet ahead before fading into black. The creek ran through a narrow gorge here, with steep rocky walls on either side rising maybe 30 or 40 feet. The water was loud, echoing off the rocks in a way that made it difficult to hear anything else. I had to stop frequently and kill my spotlight, letting my ears adjust to the ambient noise, listening for any sound that might indicate people nearby, voices, movement, even the snap of a branch. About a quarter mile downstream, I found something that made me stop and examine more carefully. A torn piece of fabric was caught on a branch overhanging the trail. blue synthetic material that could have been from a jacket or windbreaker. It was recent, the edges weren't weathered, and there was no moss or mildew on it. I bagged it carefully as evidence and continued on. The gorge was getting narrower as I descended, the walls closing in. The sound of the creek was amplified here, a constant roar that vibrated in my chest. The air felt heavier, damper, and I could see my breath in clouds even though the temperature was only around 20 degrees. Water does that, cools the air around it, creates microclimates. I was maybe half a mile from camp when I saw the light. It was ahead of me, around a bend in the gorge, a faint glow like a flashlight or headlamp. Not moving, just steady and constant, illuminating something around the corner that I couldn't see yet. My first thought was relief. I'd found them, or at least found someone. I called out immediately, my voice competing with the creek noise. "Hello, Alaska Wildlife Services. I'm here to help." The light didn't move. It just stayed there, steady and unmoving, around the bend where the gorge curved to the left. I approached, cautiously, one hand on my sidearm, not because I expected trouble, but because something about the situation felt wrong. The light should have moved when I called out. Someone should have responded. As I rounded the bend, I could see it clearly now, a headlamp, still on, lying on the rocky ground. The LED was still bright, battery strong. The elastic band stretched out like it had been pulled off someone's head rather than removed normally. It was warm to the touch when I picked it up, like it had been worn recently, body heat not yet dissipated in the cold air. I played my spotlight around the immediate area, looking for whoever had been wearing it. The gorge had opened up here into a natural amphitheater, a bowl-shaped space maybe 30 yards across with steep rocky walls all around rising 40 or 50 feet. The creek pooled in the center before continuing downstream through another narrow gap. The acoustics were strange here. Sounds echoed and overlapped, creating layers of noise that made it difficult to pinpoint any specific source. That's when I saw the blood. Not a lot, just a few drops on the rocks near where the water pooled. I crouched down to examine them more carefully. Fresh, not yet dried, still slightly liquid in the center, though the edges were beginning to congeal in the cold. I pulled out a collection kit and swabbed a sample, sealing it in a sterile tube for analysis later. I followed the pattern and found more. A sparse trail of drops leading deeper into the amphitheater, toward the far wall where the shadows were thickest. Not arterial spray, not the kind of blood loss that indicates a major injury. More like someone with a bleeding wound walking or being moved. Drops falling occasionally from a cut hand or gashed head. My radio crackled with dispatch checking in. I reported my location and what I'd found. The headlamp, the blood trail, still no sign of the campers. They told me backup was now 20 minutes out and asked if I wanted to hold position and wait. I should have said yes. Every piece of training I'd ever received said to wait for backup in situations like this, especially when you're alone in unfamiliar terrain in the dark. But someone was bleeding, possibly badly injured, and 20 minutes in the cold could mean the difference between saving a life and recovering a body. I've made that choice before, prioritizing immediate rescue over personal safety. Sometimes you get medals for it. Sometimes you get killed. I told dispatch I was continuing the search and to send backup to my GPS coordinates when they arrived. The blood trail led me to the far side of the amphitheater, where the rock wall created a natural alcove. And that's where I found them. 4 people, sitting in a circle on the flat rocks, completely still. They were facing inward toward the center of their circle, their backs to me, and none of them moved when I called out. None of them even seemed to acknowledge my presence. "Alaska Wildlife Services, are you injured? Can you respond?" Nothing. They just sat there, motionless except for the slight rise and fall of their backs as they breathed. I could see that much. They were alive. They were breathing. But they weren't responding. I approached slowly, my spotlight illuminating them one by one as I circled around to where I could see their faces. 3 men, 1 woman, all wearing hiking clothes that matched the gear I'd seen in the tents. Ages ranging from maybe late 20s to mid-40s. Their eyes were open, staring, but there was nothing there, no recognition, no awareness, no reaction to my light or my voice. Just blank stares into the space between them, at the rocky ground where there was nothing at all to look at. Their mouths were slightly open, and I could hear them breathing, but it was synchronized in a way that human breathing shouldn't be. 4 people, all inhaling at exactly the same moment, holding for the same count, exhaling together, like they were a single organism rather than 4 individuals. "I'm Officer Kowalski. I'm here to help. Can you tell me what happened?" Still no response. I came around to where I could see their faces and my blood went cold. Their eyes were open, but there was nothing there, no recognition, no awareness, just blank stares into the space between them. Their mouths were slightly open and I could hear them breathing, but it was wrong somehow. Too synchronized, too rhythmic, and they were all looking at the same spot on the ground, where there was nothing at all. I knelt down in front of the woman, waving my hand in front of her face. No reaction. I checked her pulse, strong and steady. Checked her pupils. They responded to light normally, but she wouldn't look at me, wouldn't acknowledge me, just kept staring at that spot on the ground. "Can you hear me?" I said, right in her face, close enough that she couldn't help but see me. Her mouth moved slightly, and I heard her whisper something. I leaned closer, my ear near her lips. "Watching?" The same word from the radio. I pulled back and checked the other 3, and they were all doing the same thing, whispering that one word, over and over, barely audible even when I was inches from their faces. "Watching, watching, watching." I keyed my radio, trying to keep my voice steady even though my hands were shaking. "Dispatch, this is Unit 23. I need immediate medical evacuation. I've found 4 of the 5 missing campers. They're alive but unresponsive. Possible shock or exposure to toxins. Requesting helicopter medevac to my location as soon as possible." "Copy that, Unit 23. Helicopter is en route from Fairbanks, ETA approximately 20 minutes. Can you provide more details on their condition?" I looked at the 4 people sitting in their circle, still staring at nothing, still whispering that word. They're conscious, but catatonic. Eyes open, breathing normal, but completely unresponsive to verbal or physical stimuli. Possible carbon monoxide exposure or psychological trauma. I'm going to try to move them to a more accessible location for pickup. "Copy. Stand by for medevac." I was about to try to get one of them to stand up when I heard it, the sound that the creek noise had been covering up until now. It was coming from the forest above the amphitheater walls, from multiple directions at once, echoing through the trees. A voice, or something like a voice. Calling out in words I could understand. "Help! Please help us!" It sounded human, desperate, terrified. The kind of cry you'd hear from someone in genuine distress. But it was coming from up there in the forest, maybe 50 or 60 feet above where I stood, and I had 4 catatonic people here who needed my immediate attention. "Help! Someone! Please!" The voice was getting closer, moving through the forest, and I could hear branches breaking, something large crashing through the underbrush. Multiple somethings. The sounds were coming from at least 3 or 4 different locations, all moving toward the amphitheater, all converging on this spot. But there was something wrong with the voices. They were too clear, too loud for the distance they were traveling. Sound doesn't carry that well through dense forest. And underneath the words there was a quality that wasn't quite right. A flatness, a lack of genuine emotion, like someone doing an impression of terror rather than actually being terrified, like something that had heard humans in distress and was mimicking the sounds without understanding what they meant. I turned my spotlight toward the forest edge and saw movement in the trees, a shape, human-sized, moving between the trunks, then another, and another. Multiple figures all moving toward the amphitheater, all calling out in that same too-perfect voice. "Help us! Please! We're lost!" The four people on the rocks began to react to the sounds. Their synchronized breathing got faster, more shallow, and they started rocking slightly back and forth, still staring at that same spot on the ground. The woman's hands were clenched into fists so tight that her knuckles had gone white. "No, no, 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 no," she whispered, the first variation from that single word "watching" I'd heard. "Don't look, don't look, don't look, don't look." The figures were at the edge of the amphitheater now, just beyond the reach of my spotlight. I could see them more clearly. They had the right general shape, the right silhouette of a human body, but something about the way they moved was wrong. Too smooth, too fluid, like they were gliding rather than walking. And their movements were synchronized, all of them stepping at the same time, all of them stopping at the same time. "Help!" they called out. And this time I could hear that the voices were completely identical. Not similar, identical. All of them speaking at exactly the same time, in exactly the same tone, with exactly the same inflection. Like a recording being played from multiple speakers. "Please help us." I pulled my sidearm and aimed it at the closest figure, keeping my spotlight trained on it. For just a moment, maybe half a second, the light hit it directly, and I saw it clearly. It looked like a person. It had the basic shape: head, torso, arms, legs. But the features were wrong, blurred, like looking at someone through frosted glass or heavy fog. And the proportions were slightly off in ways I couldn't quite articulate. The arms were too long, or the head was too small, or the legs bent at angles that human legs shouldn't bend. And the eyes, when my light caught them, reflected back like an animal's. That bright eye shine you get from deer or wolves or bears when you hit them with a spotlight at night. The four people on the rocks started screaming. It was sudden and unified, all four of them opening their mouths and producing this horrible sound, high-pitched and sustained and absolutely inhuman in its intensity. Not a scream of pain or fear, but something else, something that vibrated in frequencies that made my teeth ache and my ears ring. They kept staring at that spot on the ground, kept rocking back and forth, but the screaming didn't stop, didn't even pause for breath. It just went on, impossibly sustained. The figures at the edge of the amphitheater retreated when the screaming started. I could hear them moving back into the forest, branches breaking, the calls of "help us" fading into the distance. Whatever they were, they didn't like that sound. It drove them away. The helicopter arrived 10 minutes later, the sound of its rotors cutting through the screaming, and we evacuated all four people. They were still catatonic when we loaded them into the bird, still whispering, watching, still wouldn't make eye contact or respond to questions. The medical team sedated them for transport, strapping them to backboards because they wouldn't stop that rocking motion, wouldn't stop staring at nothing. We found the fifth camper the next day during a full search of the area. 12 officers, search dogs, helicopter support, grid pattern sweep of the entire gorge and surrounding forest. He was about 2 miles downstream from where I'd found the others, alive but in the same catatonic state. Sitting on a rock beside the creek, staring at the water, whispering that same word. Watching, watching, watching. We searched for another 3 days looking for any explanation, any clue to what had happened. We found the figures' tracks at the edge of the amphitheater, dozens of them, pressed into the soft soil where the forest met the rocky bowl. But they were wrong. Impossible. 3-toed prints, arranged in a pattern that didn't match any animal in Alaska or anywhere else. And like the prints I'd found at the campsite, they didn't lead anywhere. They just appeared at the forest edge, as if whatever made them had materialized there and then vanished when they retreated. We never found any other signs of what had been out there that night. No dens, no feeding sites, no scat, no hair samples. Nothing that would explain those voices, those shapes, those impossible tracks. The 5 campers spent 3 days in the hospital in Anchorage under observation and psychiatric evaluation. One by one, they came out of their catatonic state. First the woman, then 2 of the men, then the other 2 over the course of the 3rd day. But none of them remembered what had happened. Their last clear memory was going to sleep in their tents on Wednesday night, the 3rd day of their trip. Everything after that was blank, a complete void in their memories. No dreams, no images, no sense of time passing, just darkness, and then waking up in the hospital. The psychiatrist who evaluated them diagnosed it as dissociative fugue state, possibly triggered by carbon monoxide exposure from a faulty camp stove, though we never found evidence of a stove malfunction or elevated CO levels in the blood work. Mass hysteria from environmental factors, he wrote in his report. Temporary dissociative state caused by extreme stress and possible toxin exposure. The patients should make a full recovery with no lasting effects. The official report listed it exactly like that. Possible carbon monoxide exposure, mass dissociative episode. All 5 campers recovered and released. The strange tracks were attributed to misidentified bear prints distorted by rain and soil conditions. The voices I'd heard were auditory hallucinations caused by stress and the acoustic properties of the gorge. Everything had an explanation, a rational cause, a box it could fit into so we could file the report and move on. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And I know that the official explanations don't account for what actually happened in that amphitheater. I've been back to Bear Creek twice since then for routine patrols, but only during the day, only when the sun is up and I can see clearly in all directions. I won't go there at night anymore. The place feels different now, wrong in a way I can't articulate. The trees seem to lean in too close. The shadows are too dark. The silence is too complete. The last time I was there, about 6 months ago, I was checking the campsite area in broad daylight, making sure everything was secure and no one had left any trash or disturbed the wildlife. It was a routine inspection, nothing unusual. But as I was walking back to my ATV, I heard my radio crackle to life. Watching? It was my own voice, recorded from that night, played back through the static. I recognized the exact tone, the exact inflection I'd used when I was trying to get the campers to respond to me. And then, in the same voice, spoken in the same way I would speak it, Jennifer. My first name. In my voice. Coming from the radio, I checked the frequency, channel 7, the same channel the campers had been using. I tried to respond, to ask who was transmitting, but I got only static. The voice didn't come back. I left Bear Creek that day and put in a formal request to have it removed from my patrol rotation. The request was approved without question. They said I'd done good work there, that I'd saved 5 lives, that I'd earned the right to avoid the place if it bothered me. They didn't ask why. They didn't need to. Everyone who works search and rescue long enough has a place they don't want to go back to. I start my new assignment next month, 300 miles south, in territory I've never worked before. Different forests, different mountains, different rivers, maybe different rules. Maybe whatever is at Bear Creek stays at Bear Creek, tied to that specific location, unable to follow. But 3 nights ago, I was at home in my apartment in Healy, lying in bed, trying to sleep, when my phone rang at 2 a.m. The sudden noise shocked me awake, my heart pounding before I was fully conscious. I grabbed the phone without thinking, still half asleep, and answered it. Hello? There was breathing on the other end. Not just breathing, synchronized breathing. Heavy, rhythmic, multiple people breathing in perfect unison. 4 distinct patterns, overlapping, in and out in exact timing. And then, very quietly, in my own voice, the exact tone and timbre and accent, like a perfect recording. Help us. We're watching. We're always watching. The line went dead. When I checked my phone's call history, there was no record of any incoming call. No number, no timestamp, nothing. Just my regular call log from earlier in the day. I haven't slept well since then. I keep my lights on at night, and I've started sleeping with my service weapon on the nightstand, even though I know that won't help. Whatever spoke to me that night on the phone, whatever was in that forest at Bear Creek, whatever made those 4 people sit in a circle and stare at nothing while they whispered about watching. It doesn't care about bullets or locked doors or distance. I've been thinking about quitting, maybe moving out of state entirely, going back to Wisconsin where the most dangerous thing is a car accident or a bad winter storm. But I don't think it matters. I don't think leaving Alaska will help, because last night I heard them again. Not on the phone this time. Outside my apartment window, in the parking lot 3 stories below. Voices, multiple voices, all speaking in perfect unison. Help us. We're lost. I didn't look. I kept my curtains closed and my eyes fixed on the opposite wall, and I waited for morning. When the sun came up, I went to the window and looked down at the parking lot. There were footprints in the fresh snow that had fallen overnight. 3-toed prints, dozens of them circling the building, and directly below my window, a message pressed into the snow in letters 3 feet high. Watching.